Welcome to the BRICS News. Today we'll explore how American citizens are suffering more than that of Palestinians. From homelessness to high loan crisis to Americans' bad reputation worldwide, despite common American citizens being way good and much better than those West European, ravish, racist, colonialist criminals. Even USA cultures are way good than that of West Europeans. But sadly, Americans are occupied by Israeli lobbyists dictated by West Europeans. We want justice. Free USA, free Palestine. How AIPAC influences US foreign policy. The truth behind America's support for Israel. In this deep dive, we explore how the American-Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC, influences US foreign policy and the complex relationship between the US and Israel. From financial aid and military support to lobbying efforts that shape Washington's decisions, this video reveals the extent to which US policies align with Israel's interests and the consequences for both Palestinians and American citizens. We examine Israel's ongoing conflict with Palestine, the human rights violations, and how US taxpayer money funds military actions in the Middle East. Explore the impact of AIPAC's influence on America's domestic issues, such as the healthcare crisis, homelessness, and education debt, as well as the global repercussions of US support for controversial Israeli policies under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. This video also takes a closer look at how American citizens and the international community view the US's role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, offering critical insights into anti-Zionist movements and calls to free America and free Palestine. If you're interested in understanding the powerful lobbying forces at play in Washington and how they affect global politics, this is the video for you. Watch now and join the conversation on US foreign policy, Israel's global role, and the fight for justice in Palestine. Let's explore in detail. Watch till the end. My dear American brothers, share your thoughts in comments if we're wrong. The influence of AIPAC and Israel on US foreign policy. An examination. The American-Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC, and Israel's influence on US foreign policy have long been subjects of debate. While some argue that AIPAC is simply an advocacy group that promotes US-Israel relations, critics assert that it holds disproportionate power, pushing US policies that primarily benefit Israel at the expense of American citizens and broader global interests. This article delves into the multifaceted dimensions of this influence, particularly focusing on how US foreign policy has increasingly been viewed as aligned with Israel's interests, and the ramifications of that alignment on both US citizens and the international community. What is AIPAC? AIPAC, founded in 1951, is a pro-Israel lobbying group in the United States that advocates for strong US-Israel relations. Its mission, as outlined, is to ensure that the United States supports Israel economically, militarily, and diplomatically. Over the decades, AIPAC has become one of the most influential lobbying organizations in Washington, D.C., with substantial political and financial resources. The organization focuses on building relationships with US lawmakers, securing foreign aid for Israel, and influencing key decisions that affect Israel's security and geopolitical stance. AIPAC's tactics and influence. AIPAC has mastered the art of lobbying, deploying a combination of grassroots mobilization, strategic alliances, and financial contributions to sway US policymakers. It channels millions of dollars in campaign contributions and organizes high-profile events where American politicians from both sides of the aisle are seen actively courting AIPAC's favor. Many critics argue that AIPAC's tactics often result in US policies that align more with Israeli interests than with the interests of the American public. This influence has drawn attention from critics who believe that AIPAC's lobbying efforts have distorted US foreign policy, putting Israeli interests above those of the American people. They argue that US foreign policy is being shaped by a foreign power and its lobbyists rather than by the needs and interests of US citizens. U.S. foreign policy's dependence on Israel. Israel is often regarded as the U.S.'s most important ally in the Middle East. The bond between the two countries is historically rooted in shared democratic values, strategic interests, and cultural ties. However, critics assert that U.S. foreign policy has shifted to a point where it seems dependent on Israel, serving the country's geopolitical agenda even when it contradicts American interests. Economic and military aid to Israel. Since 1948, Israel has been one of the largest recipients of U.S. foreign aid, particularly military aid. The U.S. government provides approximately $3.8 billion annually in military assistance to Israel, a commitment solidified under a 10-year Memorandum of Understanding signed during the Obama administration. Critics of this relationship argue that such extensive aid is unjustifiable, particularly when the U.S. faces a myriad of domestic issues, including homelessness, healthcare, and education crises. They point out that American taxpayers' money is funding Israeli military operations, some of which are seen as violations of international law. American support for Israeli policies. Despite global criticism, Israel's ongoing conflict with the Palestinians has drawn international condemnation, particularly for its military operations in Gaza, the expansion of illegal settlements in the West Bank, and its treatment of Palestinian civilians. Yet, the US has consistently shielded Israel from global criticism, using its veto power in the United Nations Security Council to block resolutions that condemn Israeli actions. This unwavering support is often viewed as a reflection of AIPAC's influence, driving US foreign policy in a direction that prioritizes Israel's interests, often at the expense of global stability and peace. Israel's human rights violations and international law. The international community, including bodies like the United Nations, has condemned Israel for its treatment of Palestinians. These allegations include violations of international law, ranging from the illegal occupation of Palestinian territories to war crimes committed during military offensives. The Palestinian question: human rights and occupation. Israel's occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza has been described as illegal under international law. The Fourth Geneva Convention prohibits the transfer of civilian populations into occupied territories, yet Israel continues to build and expand settlements in these regions. The expansion of settlements is seen as a direct obstacle to peace, as it erodes the possibility of a viable two-state solution. Moreover, human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, have accused Israel of apartheid-like policies, systematically discriminating against Palestinians in a manner that deprives them of basic rights. These accusations extend to the excessive use of force, arbitrary arrests, torture, and the killing of civilians, especially during military operations in Gaza. Attack on UN peacekeeping forces. In addition to the violence directed at Palestinians, Israel has been accused of attacking United Nations peacekeeping forces. In 2006, Israeli forces bombed a UN peacekeeping post in southern Lebanon, killing 4 observers. While Israel claimed the attack was an accident, many saw it as part of a broader pattern of aggressive behavior towards international actors that criticize or attempt to intervene in its military actions. The role of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's longest-serving prime minister, has been a polarizing figure both domestically and internationally. His hawkish policies, particularly regarding Iran and the Palestinian territories, have contributed to increased tensions in the region. Netanyahu has consistently rejected international calls for peace negotiations with Palestinians, favoring a hardline approach that emphasizes military strength over diplomacy. Netanyahu's domestic unpopularity and global aggression. Despite facing significant domestic opposition, including widespread protests over corruption charges and his handling of internal affairs, Netanyahu has remained a dominant figure in Israeli politics. His administration has been marked by an aggressive foreign policy stance, particularly against Iran and any perceived threats to Israel's security. Netanyahu's leadership has been characterized by rhetoric that many view as inflammatory. He has threatened military action against Iran, warned European nations against siding with Palestinians, and used harsh language against Israel's critics. Despite this, the US government has largely continued to back Netanyahu's government, a testament, critics say, to AIPAC's influence in ensuring unwavering US support for Israel, regardless of the actions of its leaders. Zionism, a controversial ideology. Zionism, the political movement advocating for the establishment and support of a Jewish homeland in Israel, has long been a source of debate. While many Jews and Israelis view Zionism as a legitimate movement aimed at securing Jewish self-determination, critics argue that modern Zionism, particularly in its militant form, has led to the oppression of Palestinians and the destabilization of the Middle East. Zionist extremism, accusations of terrorism. Critics of Zionism, particularly its more extreme elements, argue that it has morphed into a nationalist ideology that justifies the use of violence and terrorism to achieve its goals. The displacement of Palestinians during the 1948 Nakba, the expansion of settlements, and the aggressive military actions taken by the Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, are often cited as examples of Zionist extremism in action. This extremism, according to critics, is not confined to Israel. Pro-Zionist lobbies like AIPAC, they argue, have exported these aggressive tactics to the US, where they influence American politicians and manipulate public discourse to favor Israel's interests. The promotion of Zionism, through various means including media and political pressure, has fostered a climate in which dissenting voices, including those of American citizens, are often marginalized. Media and propaganda. Controlling the narrative. A key component of AIPAC and Israel's influence in the US is their ability to shape the media narrative. Israel and its supporters have been accused of using propaganda to maintain a favorable image in the American media, often portraying Israel as a beleaguered democracy surrounded by hostile enemies. This narrative, critics argue, obscures the reality of Israel's actions in the occupied territories and its role in perpetuating the conflict. Israeli soldiers on social media, a controversial strategy. In recent years, there has been a rise in the use of social media by Israeli soldiers, particularly on platforms like TikTok. These soldiers often post images and videos that some view as an attempt to humanize the Israeli military and portray a more relatable, accessible side of Israel's defense forces. Critics, however, argue that this is part of a broader propaganda campaign designed to distract from the realities of the occupation and the suffering of Palestinians. Moreover, the use of sexualized content by some Israeli soldiers on social media has sparked controversy. Detractors claim that this is a deliberate strategy to promote Zionism and distract from the country's military actions. By shifting attention towards more superficial content, Israel, they argue, is trying to deflect criticism of its human rights abuses and illegal occupation. US domestic issues, a contrast to the focus on Israel. While the US continues to pour billions of dollars into supporting Israel, many Americans are struggling with domestic issues that remain unresolved. Homelessness, healthcare costs, student debt, and the ever-growing wealth gap are just some of the problems facing American citizens today. Critics of the US-Israel relationship argue that the billions spent on foreign aid to Israel could be better used to address these domestic crises. The homelessness crisis. In cities across the US, homelessness has reached crisis levels. From New York to Los Angeles, tens of thousands of Americans are living on the streets, unable to afford housing in a country with one of the highest costs of living in the world. Despite this, the US government continues to prioritize foreign aid, particularly to Israel, over domestic welfare. Critics question why billions of US taxpayer dollars are sent to support a foreign nation, especially one often embroiled in human rights controversies, while millions of American citizens struggle to meet basic needs like shelter, food, and healthcare. This disconnect between US government priorities and the reality of domestic crises forms a central pillar of the argument that America is acting as Israel's slave, with Israel's interests taking precedence over those of US citizens. Healthcare and education crisis. The US healthcare system is often criticized for being one of the most expensive in the world, with millions of Americans unable to afford proper medical care. Similarly, student debt has become a national issue, with the total amount of student loans surpassing $1.7 trillion, burdening young Americans and impacting their economic futures. Despite these urgent concerns, US policymakers continue to funnel money and resources into supporting Israel's military apparatus, which critics argue does little to benefit the average American. Those opposed to the current US-Israel dynamic contend that American taxpayers' money should be invested in solving domestic problems like healthcare, education, and infrastructure. The argument is that US citizens are being neglected in favor of a foreign policy agenda that serves a small, influential group of pro-Israel lobbyists, particularly AIPAC, at the expense of broader American interests. AIPAC's influence on US politics. Control or lobbying. One of the most contentious points in the debate over AIPAC's influence is whether the organization merely engages in lobbying, as countless other interest groups do, or if it holds a disproportionate level of control over US politicians. AIPAC has been highly effective in building bipartisan support for Israel, and its influence is evident in the fact that almost all major US politicians support the annual aid package to Israel, irrespective of public opinion. Lobbying versus control, the power of campaign contributions. AIPAC, while not directly contributing to political campaigns, mobilizes significant financial resources through pro-Israel political action committees, PACs, and wealthy donors. By financially backing pro-Israel candidates and pressuring others who question US-Israel policies, AIPAC has created a political environment where criticism of Israel is seen as politically dangerous. For example, politicians who express opposition to Israeli policies or call for re-evaluating US foreign aid to Israel often find themselves targeted by well-funded smear campaigns. This creates a chilling effect on political discourse, where many lawmakers are reluctant to speak out against Israel, fearing political retribution. Critics argue that this influence goes beyond typical lobbying, amounting to political control where Israel, through AIPAC, dictates US foreign policy in the Middle East. Political blacklisting and silencing critics. Several politicians, including Congresswomen Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, have faced intense backlash for their criticism of Israel. Both women, who are vocal advocates for Palestinian rights, have been accused of anti-Semitism by AIPAC supporters, though they contend their criticisms are aimed at the Israeli government, not the Jewish people. The targeting of such figures raises questions about freedom of speech and political discourse in the US. Are American lawmakers free to express their views on Israel and its policies? Or does AIPAC's influence suppress legitimate debate? This concern becomes even more acute when critics of Israel are labeled as anti-Semitic, a charge that can effectively end political careers in the US. The US's unwavering support for Israel, particularly during contentious military conflicts, has damaged its reputation globally. Many countries view the US as complicit in Israel's actions, particularly in regard to its treatment of Palestinians. The US's use of its veto power in the United Nations to block resolutions condemning Israel has further fueled this perception. One of the most significant criticisms leveled at the US is the perceived hypocrisy in its foreign policy. While the US positions itself as a champion of democracy and human rights, its support for Israel, despite the latter's repeated violations of international law, calls this stance into question. The killing of civilians in Gaza, the expansion of illegal settlements, and the harsh treatment of Palestinian protesters are regularly met with condemnation from the international community. However, the US continues to back Israel, weakening its moral authority when it calls out other countries for similar human rights abuses. The US's staunch defense of Israel has also led to increasing isolation on the international stage. particularly in Europe and the Middle East. Many European nations have distanced themselves from Israel due to its treatment of Palestinians, and countries in the Middle East view the US as a biased actor that cannot be trusted to broker peace. This perception has led to strained relationships with key US allies and has undermined American efforts to present itself as an impartial mediator in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Moreover, the US's focus on defending Israel has alienated many in the global South, where nations are more sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. This shift is evident in international organizations like the United Nations, where votes condemning Israel often pass overwhelmingly, with only the US and a handful of other countries standing in opposition. One of the central arguments made by critics of US foreign policy is that American interests are being placed second to those of Israel. This idea resonates strongly in discussions about how the US government allocates resources and formulates policies. With major domestic crises such as healthcare, education, and homelessness, critics argue that US leaders are more focused on supporting Israel than addressing the pressing needs of their own citizens. The US national debt is one of the largest in the world, having surpassed $33 trillion. Meanwhile, significant funds continue to flow to Israel in the form of military aid. Critics argue that this financial support could be better spent addressing America's own economic challenges, such as reducing the national debt or investing in infrastructure and social programs. The disconnect between US priorities and domestic needs highlights the extent to which Israel's interests appear to dominate US policy. The US education system is plagued by underfunding and exorbitant student loan debt. The amount spent on supporting Israel could, critics argue, make a significant difference in improving public education, providing scholarships, and alleviating the burden of student loans. Instead, US funds are used to support military activities abroad, which often contribute to instability in the Middle East rather than investing in the future of America's youth. Many activists and commentators argue that both Palestinians and American citizens are victims of Israeli occupation, though in different ways. The Free Palestine movement, which advocates for the end of Israeli occupation and the establishment of a Palestinian state, has increasingly been linked to a broader critique of US foreign policy, particularly in relation to AIPAC's influence. While the nature of the struggles faced by Americans and Palestinians differs significantly, some see parallels in the way both groups are affected by US policies. For Palestinians, US support for Israel translates into continued occupation, violence, and human rights abuses. For Americans, the argument is that US support for Israel comes at the expense of domestic investment, leading to economic inequality, crumbling infrastructure, and inadequate social services. The call for Free America echoes sentiments that US citizens need to reclaim their government from the influence of foreign lobbies like AIPAC. Proponents argue that American governance should prioritize the needs of its citizens rather than serving the interests of a foreign country. This call is not just about reducing aid to Israel, but about restructuring US foreign policy to reflect a more balanced, equitable approach that takes into account the interests of the American people. In response to AIPAC's influence, several anti-Zionist and anti-AIPAC movements have emerged, advocating for a more critical approach to US-Israel relations. These groups argue that the US should adopt a more balanced stance in the Middle East, one that considers the rights and needs of Palestinians as well as Israelis. They also call for greater transparency in how foreign policy decisions are made and for the US government to be more responsive to the concerns of its citizens rather than foreign lobbyists. The debate over AIPAC's influence on US foreign policy and the broader US-Israel relationship is complex, encompassing issues of lobbying, military aid, human rights, and domestic priorities. Critics argue that AIPAC has exerted undue influence over US politicians, steering foreign policy in a direction that benefits Israel at the expense of American citizens and international stability. There is a growing call for the US to re-evaluate its relationship with Israel and to consider whether the current level of support is justified, given the domestic challenges facing the country. Many argue that American foreign policy should prioritize the needs of its own citizens, and that US involvement in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict should be more balanced, with an emphasis on promoting peace and justice for all involved. Ultimately, the question of AIPAC's influence touches on broader themes of democracy, sovereignty, and the role of special interests in shaping government policy. For many Americans, the time has come to reclaim their government and ensure that US foreign policy reflects their needs and values. The demand for a more independent and citizen-focused government, one that prioritizes domestic welfare over foreign entanglements, is becoming louder. The calls to free America and free Palestine are intertwined, as both groups are seen as victims of a US foreign policy overly influenced by AIPAC and its alignment with Israeli interests. In conclusion, the disproportionate influence that AIPAC wields over US foreign policy has led to a situation where American resources, both financial and political, are used to support a nation accused of numerous human rights violations, while pressing domestic issues remain unaddressed. As more Americans become aware of this imbalance, the push for change grows stronger. The call for a re-evaluation of US-Israel relations is not just about foreign policy, but about reclaiming American governance for the benefit of its people and ensuring that US leadership truly reflects the values of justice, equity, and self-determination both at home and abroad.